Thank you so much for watching Help I Can Vote. My name is Luke, and perhaps you're wondering what qualifications I have to speak to you about voting. And the answer is not much. I'm just a guy. I went to film school. But I do really love ideas. I have been following politics for as long as I can remember. I can remember listening to the news in the car with my mom when we would drive around. So I've been thinking about it a lot. And I also have a real desire to help followers of Jesus connect the Bible to politics. Personally, I feel like there's a great lack of instruction on that in the church today. I am aware of a book by David Platt, which I read in preparation for this class, or whatever you want to call this time together, and it was very helpful. And I do have a book back there by, it's not actually by C.S. Lewis. I thought it was by C.S. Lewis, but it was somebody examining the works of C.S. Lewis in an attempt to sort of divine what it was he would have to say about politics. And so that's, I just think there's a real lack of helping followers of Jesus connect what the Bible has to say to politics so that they can then make a decision about how to vote. So that's what we're going to try and do today in this time together is we're going to try and look at the Bible and see if we can't come to some conclusions about voting. Many in our culture, when they discuss politics, really like to claim objectivity. News networks claim to be fair and balanced, or they claim to be just reporting the news, or that kind of thing. Surely you're familiar with that. There's this veneer of objectivity that people put on themselves, and I really dislike it. I think it is nearly always a ploy to get you to put your brain to sleep and just accept whatever it is the person has to say because he's objective, she's objective. So you listen to them. Your ears are open to the objective person giving you the objective truth. And then you do what they say. You believe what they say. You vote for whoever they tell you to vote for. Well, because that's objectively what I'm supposed to do. And so I think it's a ploy, and I really dislike it. I am not objective. I am a follower of Jesus Christ. I believe the Bible contains within it all we need for life and godliness. And my plan, I do intend on November 5th to vote for Donald J. Trump. Now, I'm not telling you that because the rest of this time together is going to be spent me trying to convince you to vote for Donald Trump. That's not the point. The point of this is to wake you up, shake you up, maybe even hopefully put you a little bit on guard so that you are thinking about what I say to you. I'm not making an objective claim. I want your brain awake and on guard to everything that I am about to say. And I want you to press it all through the scriptures to decide, is what I'm saying correct or not? This is not about getting you to vote for Donald Trump, okay? Not the point here. So what is it about? As I thought about this time, I think there's two ways to go about talking about this. The first way is we could go issue by issue, right? We could pull up Vice President Harris, we could pull up former President Trump, and we could sort of go item by item through what they think and sort of debunk or affirm or whatever. The other option is we could take a more high-level worldview sort of approach. And that's the approach that I've settled on, for good or for ill. And I settled on that approach for three reasons. First of all, it will help you to vote now because we are going to discuss a few specific issues. It will also help you to vote in the future. 20 years from now, when we're dealing, maybe some of the issues that we have today will be solved in 20 years, and there will be new issues that are not even on any of our radar. And talking about a biblical worldview will help you sort out new issues as they arise in the future. And then thirdly, having a biblical worldview will just help you in your everyday life, even as you think about things that aren't even necessarily political. So, worldview. What is it? Stephen Covey, in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he uses the analogy, he compares worldview to a map. And I really like that for a few reasons. One of them is that if you have the wrong map, all the work that you do in the world probably isn't going to get you to your destination. You might get lucky and wind up where you intended to go, but if you don't have a map, you are in deep, deep trouble. The other really neat thing about maps is that maps can vary profoundly. In the United States, for example, when we are looking for the address, we begin with a building number and we navigate to that building number by streets. You know, something is on the corner of East and Main, right? And then we get there and then we locate the house number. On the other side of the world, in Japan, they don't actually name streets. They number or name blocks. So you find a specific block, and then all the numbers of the buildings on that block, they're not numbered in order like they are in the United States. You drive through a neighborhood and it's 112, 113, 114. Sometimes they ping pong the odd numbers on one side of the road and the even numbers on the other side of the road. In Japan, they number the houses by the order in which they were built. So they could be random, right? So maps can vary enormously. The other reason why a map is really helpful is because your map determines what you do, and what you do determines what you get. So what you see determines what you do, determines what you get. What you see is your map. What you do, in this case, we're talking very specifically about voting. And then what you get is the policy if the politician manages to deliver on his or her promises, which isn't that a thing? So when we ask the question, how am I supposed to decide who to vote for? There is an answer to that question. And the answer to that question is you will vote your worldview. If you believe, if you see, if your map of everything that happens to you in your life is your feelings, then you will vote for the candidate who gives you the best feelings. If your worldview is prosperity, then you will vote for either the candidate who promises to give you the most free stuff, or you will perhaps vote for the candidate who promises to cut your taxes the lowest. If your worldview is security, you will vote for the candidate who promises perhaps to boost military spending. Or on the other hand, maybe you would vote for the candidate who promises to, or manages to convince you that she can do a really great job with diplomacy. Or if you believe, as Vice President Kamala Harris said, quote, equitable treatment means we all end up at the same place, then you're going to vote for somebody who will ensure that we all end up at the same place. Whatever your worldview is, that is how you will vote. It is absolutely unavoidable. You can't escape it. So, before we can start looking at what is the biblical worldview and how does it apply to voting, we have to first decide if the biblical worldview even allows for us to vote, right? If we want to obey God and do what the Bible says, should we even vote? Is that a thing? And then secondly, if the Bible does say that we can vote, then we have to have a really basic understanding of how voting works here in the United States. That's where I am. I don't know, maybe somebody's watching this on the other side of the world, in which case you'd have to figure that out yourself. So the first question then, should we, as followers of Jesus Christ, people who believe in God's word, should we even vote? Millions of people do not vote. 2020 was the highest year of voter turnout in recorded American history, and only 66.6% of eligible voters voted. Do not let that percentage impact how you view the results of who won that election. Sometimes less than 50% of eligible voters vote. In fact, pretty often, particularly in midterms. Midterms is generally lower turnout. Midterms is when the president isn't being voted for. So why don't all these people vote? I think there are at least 3 reasons. The first one is logistics. You have to get registered to vote. You got to find a place to vote. You may have to get the time off from work to vote. Generally, employers let you do this. You have to stand in line with other people, and you have to wonder, who are they voting for? Who is she voting for? You know, it's kind of sketchy. If there are any barriers to doing that, like if you're sick or somehow immobile, maybe you've broken your leg or been hurt, or maybe you've recently moved and so you don't know how to get registered in your new state, or maybe you're still registered in your old state, all that stuff can kind of come together to cause people not to vote for just purely logistical reasons. Another reason many people don't vote is apathy. They just don't care. They maybe think all politicians are corrupt, or they're morons, or these apathetic people sometimes they're not apathetic in terms of emotionless or not caring. Sometimes they care so much, but they hate the system, so they don't vote. Sometimes people in this apathetic category are people who believe there's some shadowy cabal running everything, and so it doesn't matter if they vote or not because, you know, the Illuminati or the Jews or, you know, some shadowy nefarious group is, you know, like the Godfather pulling all the strings, and so it doesn't matter if they vote or not because whatever's going to happen, you know, that little oligarchy is going to do it. The third reason I think a lot of people don't vote, some people don't vote anyway, in our circles, in our Christian circles, is theology. There are some Christian sects, like the Amish in particular, who believe that voting would fall into the category of friendship with the world. So they don't do it. Some Christians believe that because all politicians are sinners, that they can't possibly sort of sully their hands by voting for them. If Jesus ain't on the ballot, I ain't voting, is sort of the way of thinking about this. But I think you should vote. And I'm going to go further than that, and I'm going to say that I believe Christians must vote. And that's strong language. I have a friend who would say that I am attempting to bind your conscience. And so there's a big case to be made here. Why do I think that Christians must vote? The first reason is that God, via the federal government of the United States of America, has given every person over the age of 18 a vote. And God commands us to be good stewards of all that we have been given. So God has used the government of the United States to give everyone over the age of 18 the ability to vote. God commands people to be good stewards of what he has given them. Therefore, we must vote. Jesus, in his parable of the talents, the master, who is God, he praises the servants who increase their gifts, who invest them, who work hard, who grow them. But to the servant who just buries his talent, what God has given him, in the ground and does nothing with it, God says, "You evil, lazy servant, if you knew that I reap where I haven't sown and gather where I haven't scattered, then you should have deposited my money with the bankers, and I would have received my money back with interest when I returned. So take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have more than enough. But from the one who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. And throw this good-for-nothing servant into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Wowzers. God's pretty serious about us being good stewards of what he's given us, and he's given each of us over the age of 18 a vote in the United States of America. So we'd better take good care of it. Second, I believe you must vote. I believe the Bible says you must vote because we're to love our neighbors. In the book of Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, someone asks Jesus, they say, "Teacher, which command in the law is the greatest?" Because there were a number of commands in the law. And Jesus said to the man, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and most important commandment. The second is like it. love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets depend on these two commands. So we are commanded to love our neighbor. And I do believe that voting responsibly, voting thoughtfully, is a way to love our neighbors. But there's a little bit of a catch in this one, because we have equated in our culture freedom with the ability to do whatever you want. And if I'm saying that you should vote to love your neighbor, there's an element of constraint in that, of some boundaries, of saying there's a foolish way to live and a wise way to live, a good way to live and a bad way to live, a sinful way to live and a righteous way to live. And we should vote for people who want to do the good way, the wise way, the righteous way to live. And that's constraining on people who may want to break past that. And at the extremes, this is really obvious, right? If I have a neighbor across the street who wants to murder the neighbor at the end of the cul-de-sac, well, it's pretty obvious that I should vote for a politician who would prevent my neighbor across the street from murdering the neighbor down the street because, well, it's a good way to love my neighbor down at the end of the cul-de-sac to prevent him from being murdered. It's also a good way to love the person who would do the murdering because murder is terribly bad for the person who commits it. It also destroys the social fabric. If neighbors are allowed to murder one another willy-nilly, suddenly every neighbor is, walking around, sneaking around, afraid of all their other neighbors. No one's having a block party. No one's going to a parade because they could be murdered by anyone at any given moment. Maybe people are, carrying guns all over the place to protect themselves or jumping at the tiniest little threat from their neighbors, perceived threat from their neighbors. So it'd be really bad. So obviously, we would want to vote for a politician who would constrain the neighbor across the street from murdering the neighbor at the end of the cul-de-sac. But what if there's a woman and she makes a mistake, or perhaps she's even a victim and is raped, and she gets pregnant, and she lives in poverty? Are you really going to vote for a politician who would prevent her from aborting that unborn baby? Are you really going to vote for someone who will force that woman to raise that unwanted child in poverty? Is that the pursuit of happiness? You see, it's really, this can be tough. Not only is it tough for that reason, but it's also tough because this principle could be carried too far. This could be what's called a principle without a limit. And so there must be a limit here somewhere, right? Because, for example, it's good for the human soul to go to church. It's good for that God made us to rest one day a week. God made us to pray. God made us to worship Him. So should we vote for a politician who would force people to go to church, force people to pray, force people to believe in God, right? Would that be good? I don't think so. So somewhere there's a limit. There's a limit on this love your neighbor principle. I mean, just consider the enormous quantity of freedom that God gives us, right? I mean, we can sin, we can blaspheme, we can murder our neighbor at the end of the cul-de-sac, we can do all of those things, and God permits it. He just doesn't smite us right away, or He doesn't make us robots who have no choice, right? So God Himself has given us an enormous amount of freedom. So somewhere in there's a limit to that principle, but I don't know how that works. I'm just going to have to let you sort that one out. So to recap, we must vote as followers of Christ because God, via the government, has given us a vote, and God commands us to be good stewards of all that He has given us. And second, we must vote because voting is a really good way to love our neighbor. And this also applies, by the way, to other countries. Our neighbors here in our immediate area, and then our neighbors inside of our whole nation, and then also in the family of nations, right? We can love people by voting for politicians who will support our allies, bring peace, things like that. These are all ways to love our neighbor via voting. Second thing we have to have an understanding of is what's the system like here in the United States that we're voting in? If we don't know that, it's very difficult to vote. So first of all, if anyone on either side of the political aisle ever says that their opponent is a threat to democracy, the first question you should ask is, what do you mean by that? Because we do not live in a democracy. The United States of America is not a democracy. It is a democratic republic. The Pledge of Allegiance, right? You don't pledge allegiance, to the republic for which it stands, right? It's not to the democracy, it's to the republic, okay? What's the difference? It's a big one. In a democracy or a pure democracy, the voters vote directly on the issues. In a democratic republic, the voters vote for representatives who then vote on the issues. So there's this sort of buffer in between the voter and the issue, and that buffer is the representative. Democratic, you vote for; republic, representative. You don't even vote for president. You vote for the Electoral College, and the Electoral College elects the president. And then those votes, the votes of the Electoral College, are ratified by the House and the Senate. If you've probably heard of January 6th, right? People use that date because on that day in 2020, that is when the House and Senate convened to ratify the votes of the Electoral College.
I want to talk to you about the Electoral College and why it matters. All right, I know this doesn't sound like the most sensational topic of the day, but stay with me because I promise you it's one of the most important. To explain why requires a very brief civics review. The President and Vice President of the United States are not chosen by a nationwide popular vote of the American people. Rather, they are chosen by 538 electors. This process is spelled out in the United States Constitution. Why didn't the founders just make it easy and let the presidential candidate with the most votes claim victory? Why did they create, and why do we continue to need this Electoral College? The answer is critical to understanding not only the Electoral College, but also America. The founders had no intention of creating a pure majority rule democracy. They knew from careful study of history what most have forgotten today or never learned. Pure democracies do not work. They implode. Democracy has been colorfully described as two wolves and a lamb voting on what's for dinner. In a pure democracy, bare majorities can easily tyrannize the rest of a country. The founders wanted to avoid this at all costs. This is why we have three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. It's why each state has 2 senators, no matter what its population, but also different numbers of representatives based entirely on population. It's why it takes a supermajority in Congress and 3/4 of the states to change the Constitution. And it's why we have the Electoral College. Here's how the Electoral College works. The presidential election happens in 2 phases. The first phase is purely democratic. We hold 51 popular elections every presidential election year, 1 in each state and 1 in D.C. On Election Day in 2012, you may have thought you were voting for Barack Obama or Mitt Romney, but you were really voting for a slate of presidential electors. In Rhode Island, for example, if you voted for Barack Obama, you voted for the state's 4 Democratic electors. If you voted for Mitt Romney, you were really voting for the state's 4 Republican electors. Part 2 of the election is held in December, and it is this December election among the state's 538 electors, not the November election, which officially determines the identity of the next president. At least 270 votes are needed to win. Why is this so important? Because the system encourages coalition building and national campaigning. In order to win, a candidate must have the support of many different types of voters from various parts of the country. Winning only the South or the Midwest is not good enough. You cannot win 270 electoral votes if only one part of the country is supporting you. But if winning were only about getting the most votes, a candidate might concentrate all of his efforts in the biggest cities or the biggest states. Why would that candidate care about what people in West Virginia or Iowa or Montana think? But you might ask, isn't the election really only about the so-called swing states? Actually, no. If nothing else, safe and swing states are constantly changing. California voted safely Republican as recently as 1988. Texas used to vote Democrat. Neither New Hampshire nor Virginia used to be swing states. Most people think that George W. Bush won the 2000 election because of Florida. Well, sort of, but he really won the election because he managed to flip one state which the Democrats thought was safe, West Virginia. Its 4 electoral votes turned out to be decisive. No political party can ignore any state for too long without suffering the consequences. Every state, and therefore every voter in every state, is important. The Electoral College also makes it harder to steal elections. Votes must be stolen in the right state in order to change the outcome of the Electoral College. With so many swing states, this is hard to predict and hard to do. But without the Electoral College, any vote stolen in any precinct in the country could affect the national outcome, even if that vote was easily stolen in the bluest California precinct or the reddest Texas one. The Electoral College is an ingenious method of selecting a president for a great, diverse republic such as our own. It protects against the tyranny of the majority, encourages coalition building, and discourages voter fraud. Our founders were proud of it. We can be too. I'm Tara Ross for Prager University.
So we don't live in a democracy, in a pure democracy. We live in a democratic republic. Second, we have a two-party system. Now, a political party, is just like any old party, right? You have a baby shower, that's a party. What is that? A group of people have gathered to do a thing, right? They've gathered to celebrate the coming birth of a child. You might have a painting party, right? A bunch of people have gathered to paint someone's house, right? They've gotten together to do a thing. The two political parties, primary political parties here in the United States, are the Democrats and the Republicans. There are other political parties, but they are very small, so small as to be pretty much irrelevant. Every once in a while, a third party can get in there and sort of mess up, quote unquote, mess up the election, the presidential election, but really there aren't any. The Independent Party is the biggest, but it's very small, as I said. It has no governing ideology, right? In other words, independent people in the Independent Party vary widely from one another. For example, what's the guy's name? Bernie Sanders, and he just was a Democrat from West Virginia, Democrat senator, and he just left the Democrat Party. Both of these guys are considered independents, and yet politically they vary widely. The Independent Party is really a catch-all party for people who don't feel that they fit either the Democrat or the Republican mold. So we've got two, Democrats and Republicans. Let's go through some of the basic lingo. The Republican Party is sometimes referred to as the right. Democrat Party is sometimes referred to as the left. Republicans, sometimes people inside the Republican Party will say that they are conservative, or they believe in conservatism. In the Democrat Party, some will say I'm a liberal, or I believe in liberalism. In the Republican Party, the Republican Party is sometimes referred to as the GOP. That's an acronym. It stands for Grand Old Party. The Democrat Party is sometimes called the Progressive Party, or someone inside of it may refer to themselves as a progressive. Generally viewed as great presidents for the Republican side are Abraham Lincoln. He was the first presidential Republican, and Ronald Reagan. Great presidents on the Democrat side are generally viewed as Franklin Delano Roosevelt and JFK. I don't know why both of them are acronyms, but that's interesting. For the Republicans, generally someone who is viewed as a bad president was Richard Nixon. And for the Democrats, generally someone who is viewed as a bad president is Jimmy Carter. The founding father who would represent a lot of the Republican ideas, even though at that time the Republican Party in name didn't exist, would be George Washington. And the Democrat who would hold that philosophy, even though the Democrat Party didn't exist, would have been Thomas Jefferson. So if you've ever seen Hamilton, you can see the clash of those people. The Republican mascot is an elephant. The Democrat mascot is a donkey. I don't know why. The Republican color is red. The Democrat color is blue. So that's why you hear people talking about red states. That generally means it's a state that votes for the Republican and the president or whatever. And a blue state, a state that votes for the Democrat. Sometimes you hear people talk about purple states. These are sometimes called swing states. You heard about those in that video earlier. You know, there's states that sometimes they go one way, sometimes they go another way. People sometimes use that color thing. There's no law that says that we have to have these two parties. It's just kind of the way that things shook out, and I believe there's a reason for that, which we will get to later, maybe in another session. There are some advantages and disadvantages to a two-party system, and I want to run through them. I've got an advantage, a sort of a neutral thing, and a disadvantage. So the main advantage of a two-party system is that the majority almost always wins. Now, the only reason I say almost is because sometimes most of the people who can vote don't vote, in which case, what did they want? Nobody knows, maybe not even them. The other reason why I say almost is because in 2016, quite famously, Donald Trump lost the popular vote. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, and yet Donald Trump became president because he won the Electoral College. We'll talk about this a little bit here. So if you contrast that with a multi-party system, many European nations have a variety of political parties. And there might be some advantages. I don't know about those. I don't live in those places. But one of the disadvantages, it seems to me, is that you could literally become prime minister, or an office sort of equivalent to president. You could become prime minister and only win 30% of the vote. I mean, if there are 5 political parties and you're one of them, and you win 30% of the vote, and the other 4 political parties divvy up that 70%, 70% of the people voted against you, and yet you are the prime minister. Suddenly, you know, when Hillary lost the popular vote, she lost by only, or rather, when Hillary won the popular vote, she only won by 2%. That's a whole lot different than 70%, which you can see happen in some of these foreign countries. Also, this is interesting to me. I just learned this the other day. But when we look at that Trump 2016 victory, the argument against the Electoral College is that it gave greater weight to the votes of people in rural areas, right? The cities all went blue, and that was most of the population of the United States, but yet Hillary lost. Trump won because of the Electoral College. So it seems unfair that more weight, it's not true, but it feels like more weight is given to the rural voters. But as early as 1920, it was actually the other way around, because 1920, the census taken in that year, was the first time ever that there were more people who living in cities than living in the country. In other words, prior to 1920, the Electoral College, again, this is the wrong word, but it gave more weight to people who lived in cities, right? Because there were more people in the country, fewer people in the cities. See what I'm talking about? And who knows, in the future, the situation may revert with all this work from home thing that's happening now. It's quite possible we could see a world again in which more people live in rural or suburban areas than live in concentrated cities. And then the Electoral College would again provide balance, some of which you saw in that video. So a neutral point, I think, is that having only 2 political parties can bring clarity. But it also, the flip side of clarity, the reason it's neutral is because it can also be exclusive. So if you are a follower of Jesus Christ who believes that abortion is something which the government should prevent, strictly limit, perhaps ban entirely under all circumstances, and you also believe that the government should intervene to combat the effects of climate change, who are you going to vote for? There isn't a politician, there isn't a political party which holds both of those viewpoints. Those things have been mapped to the pro-life issue is Republican, and the government intervention to combat effects of climate change is a Democrat position, generally speaking. So you may not be able to find somebody who fits everything that you believe, because we live in this sort of two-party, bifurcated, strictly delineated system. I think the good thing about that, though, is that it forces you as a voter to really rank your priorities and say, okay, push has come to shove. I'm here in the ballot box. I have two choices. Which of these issues is most important? And then you have to vote accordingly. And I think that when people are forced to think, it's good, I think. And then the disadvantage is that I think that a two-party system, there can be partisanship. Now, obviously, you can have partisanship if you have a million political parties, but partisanship is just the idea that you root for your side sort of no matter what, right? Like, you see this in sports, people, they're diehard fans of whoever, and they root for that team even when they lose, even when the manager is corrupt, even when everything is terrible, they're still out there, rah, rah, and people can be that way with political parties. Oh, I vote for a Republican no matter what, all the time. Or I vote for Democrats all the time, no matter what. Doesn't matter what the scandals are, doesn't matter what the levels of corruption are. I'm in this pocket every single time. And really, I said that you can have partisanship in any number of parties, and that's true. But I think when you've got two, it's a little more intense. Again, think about a sports team, and you have, the Colts and the Patriots, right? That was a rivalry when Peyton Manning and Tom Brady were both playing, and every time they'd get together, everybody would be excited to watch, and the ratings would be huge for those games, but then what happens? Well, Tom Brady and Peyton Manning retire, and there's 30 some other teams in the NFL, and suddenly nobody cares anymore. And so that can happen when you've got a multi-party system. But when the only two teams in the NFL are the Colts and the Patriots, or when the only two teams in politics are the Democrats and Republicans, and they play against each other in every single election, I think it can breed that sort of partisanship. Every time it's us versus them, baby, and we gotta win. And partisanship should have no place amongst followers of Christ. We don't serve a political party. We serve God, and we are citizens in heaven, and there's going to be more on that later. But if a political party or if a politician departs from a biblical worldview or from righteousness, then they should lose the support of Christians. Now, again, that's a principle without a limit, right? Because everybody sins. And so it's entirely possible to have a perfect candidate in terms of the things that they believe and the things that they want to do biblically, but how much sin is enough sin to lose your support? That's a difficult question, and I think one for the individual Christian conscience.